So welcome once again, everyone, to this first meeting that I've convened for all of us as valued partners, as the council, who have been mobilising and working across a whole raft of issues since we were challenged by COVID-19 back in March 2020. And this is the Cost of Living Summit taking place this morning, and I thank everyone for making time to be part of these vital conversations. After the election back in May, I announced at a full council meeting that in light of the very concerning issues facing households in Newham, that I was going to be establishing a cost of living crisis task force. And this summit is a part of a series of things and activities and actions that we've been undertaking since before the summer in anticipation of what will be a very brutal autumn-winter months. And as we reel from the implications of the price cap on energy costs that were announced by Ofgem, no doubt most of us are thinking deeply about the catastrophic impact of any further increases in energy costs that are being mooted that could go up to some £5,000. We meet this morning in a curious week. We have a new Prime Minister who was formally acknowledged as being the Prime Minister yesterday by Her Majesty the Queen, and we are hearing that there will be some quite significant announcements this week from the Prime Minister and her new government. And notwithstanding that, the research that we've undertaken through a commissioning of PDR, we've got Chris and Will with us, they will be presenting the impact of the cost of living crisis facing Newham residents and also businesses in the borough. So the purpose of this meeting is to present to you the stark reality of what will be facing us. And in light of the mobilisations that we've undertaken with all of you over the last 3 years in response to the cost of the COVID-19 impact, both in health terms but also in economic terms, we need a similar mobilisation and build on what we've put in place in response to the crisis that will be facing many households in this borough. We will then be breaking into breakout groups, and we will want to be exploring with you some key actions that we would like to be mobilising around, and also understanding and driving into whether or not there are some nuances or key insights that we may have missed, or there are key other things that we are going to need to be doing that we haven't adequately captured. In terms of the presentation that we'll talk through with you shortly, I will be concluding with some specifics that we'll be putting in place, and I trust that colleagues on this call will be pleased to hear about those, and those will be also promoted via our social media and our media engagement. But as I said, this is the start of a series of conversations that we will be having. It's a very important area of our work that's going to shape the coming 4 years of my second term, absolutely, because we know that the pressures and risks of inflation will remain for a pronounced and prolonged period of time, and the conflict in Ukraine following the assault by Russia, there is no presently end in sight, and that will have an ongoing impact on global supply chains. So we have a huge challenge in this borough, and the particular point that I wanted to emphasise and ask that you all consider and reflect on as you listen and hear the presentation that Will and Chris Paddock from PDR talk through is in the context of Newham. our resident population and our borough profile is such that the issues of disproportionality very much are amplified as they were during the cost of living. Disproportionality in economic terms will mean that certain cohorts of our resident population will find the cost of living crisis even more pronounced, and we have the real reality of families facing the cliff edge. In addition, we will be undoubtedly seeing new cohorts of families who wouldn't necessarily be looking for help, being part of the section of our borough that will be needing support. And that's an important element of what we're going to need to discuss and respond to. So I'm going to, at this juncture, invite Chris and Will to commence with their presentation, and at various junctures I may pause and invite any additional input from council colleagues that I have on this Zoom call, who I'll ask to introduce themselves. And if anyone has any questions, if you could kindly raise your hand, or if you've got a thought, feel free to drop it into the chat. Thank you very much. Over to you, Will and Chris.
Okay, do we need to share the presentation, or is our colleagues going to share it?
Okay, so I'm assuming, Anne, you've got access to the presentation and you can share and go straight into the section relating to PDR.
Okay, so thanks for having us along. We've been undertaking a piece of research really over the last couple of weeks as the scale and the impact of the cost of living crisis has become more apparent, to start to tease out some of the specific issues that Newham will face, and we're kind of presenting this for consideration and to help us form a more action-orientated discussion at the end of this. Just by way of introduction, we've been working with Newham for the last couple of years through the COVID-19 pandemic response, providing evidence and insight to support that, and now we've been asked to have a look at the cost of living crisis as well. I think it's really important, before we get into the specifics of the data relating to cost of living, to recognise that this is a crisis following a previous crisis. So we're coming hot off the heels of the ongoing impact of the pandemic, to a point where, you know, we're starting another type of crisis, which is inherently linked to the impact of the pandemic, but from a challenged baseline already.
I think you've gone on mute, Chris.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I didn't touch anything, but we'll keep our arms folded. Yeah, we know that Newham was one of the hardest hit local authorities within the country, which was, you know, born out of the existing baseline around poverty, and particularly deep poverty within the borough. You know, the government are quick to tell us that unemployment is going down and that poverty has sort of flattened out over the course of the last couple of parliaments, but actually, when you look at deep poverty, that's increased quite significantly, and boroughs like Newham are particularly exposed to that, and particularly to in-work poverty. So, you know, you've got 50% of young people within Newham who are living within poverty, and the increase within those young people living within poverty are almost 100% in working families. So, you know, the idea that you get people into work and then they can get themselves out of poverty isn't really working for Newham as it was in the past. Newham has the second lowest disposable rate of disposable income within London at the moment, and that was true at the start of the pandemic. And we know through our research through the pandemic that Newham residents are more likely to be disproportionately impacted within that. So the pandemic itself and the economic system more generally has been a driver of disproportionality and inequality. When you overlay that with issues around health, the second lowest level of life expectancy within London, high levels of childhood obesity, increasing numbers of people relying on food banks, it is pretty stark stuff already at the start of this crisis. And I think as we think about the crisis, it's important to note that the response from the government, whatever we hear over the next couple of days, is not going to be as significant as it was to COVID-19, because COVID-19 was quite an equal crisis. We were sort of all in it together. This will be more just diffuse and it's more complicated. So in the data that we're going to present now, we're going to try and tease out some of the factors that will drive the cost of living crisis and the inequality challenges that will be born out of that. So I'll hand over to Will, who's going to talk about some of the specifics, and then we'll just reflect on that at the end of that presentation.
Thanks, Chris. So what we're going to present to you today is a synopsis, really, of what is quite a detailed evidence base we brought together to sort of underpin this summit today. And I think it's really important that we share those slides with this group after the session today, because there's a lot of sort of detail that underpins this work. And I think the way we've approached this is looked at the sort of the. Oh, sorry. Can you see me now? Hopefully. So I think the important thing that we've tried to do through this work is to look at the layered factors and the layered factors that are sort of contributing to this cost of living crisis, because typically a lot of the analysis in relation to this tends to take one factor at a time. So, for example, it looks at food poverty, we look individually at fuel poverty as well, and then we look at individual factors like housing quality, energy efficiency, and those things. But when we actually layer these things together, we can see what the net impact is on residents on a monthly basis. So I think the thing to sort of just reinforce, to set the tone going into this, is that if we listen to government on a lot of this stuff, I think you'd be fooled into thinking that London was sort of relatively resilient to a lot of the cost of living crisis pressures in terms of things like average earnings, in terms of things like being in work and that sort of thing. But when we sort of look at all of these factors together, I think our argument and sort of going into this is that actually London is disproportionately impacted across a range of measures when you take into account things like housing, and we're going to talk a bit about that in a second. But I think the key thing to get across to you is a lot of the essential spend that residents have to spend their money on. There's a London price premium paid on a lot of those things, including fuel and including food as well. So that's just to set the scene. If we can go on to the next slide, please, we'll get into some detail of some of these factors that are affecting exposure within Newham specifically. So the first thing to sort of talk about is fuel poverty, and this is something that won't be a surprise to anyone on this call probably, but Newham has the second highest fuel poverty in the whole of London, but also the 21st highest fuel poverty rate in the whole of the country. And there's a couple of reasons driving this exposure. The first is the fact that a significant proportion of residents are on prepaid electricity meters. So Newham has the third highest number of residents on prepaid electricity meters in London, and it has the sort of top amount in terms of usage. But when we break it down by sort of looking at it within the borough, we know that there's sort of a disproportionate amount of residents living in fuel poverty towards the northeast of the borough, and that is broadly where the borough's sort of lower quality housing stock in terms of energy performance rating is located. So if we go on to the next slide, this sort of helps to bring it out in a little bit more detail. What we've also done is we've looked at the energy performance rating of buildings across the borough, because we know that that has a massive effect on the price that residents will be paying for energy bills. So the data effectively shows there's around 16,000 households in Newham that are living in properties that are band E or worse, so bands E to band G. And we know that for all residents living in a band G energy performance rating property, they'll be paying around 190% more for their energy than those that are living in a band A to C property. So there's wider exposure factors that we need to consider too when we're looking at the cost of living, and housing quality is definitely one of them. So if we go on to the next slide, please. The third factor, and probably the most important thing that's been absent from the debate in relation to this, is housing, the housing stock more generally, and the housing market, and specifically housing tenure. So this is relatively relevant data, I think, looking at deprivation across the borough. We know that deprivation is very high in Newham. Newham's the 12th most deprived local authority in the country. But one of the key drivers behind that deprivation is the barriers to housing and services domain. I don't think those colours are particularly helpful for this, but effectively what that chart on the bottom right is showing is that 100% of neighbourhoods within Newham fall within the top 10% most deprived nationally for barriers to housing and services. So we move on to the next slide, specifically looking at the evidence. I think there is a significant exposure factor is around housing tenure. And we've spent quite a lot of time in this, and you'll see when you receive the evidence slides that disproportionately people that are living in the private rental sector are very exposed to these cost of living challenges, especially in relation to the global rental squeeze that we're currently seeing at the moment, which is resulting in skyrocketing private rents and really poor conditions for tenants generally. So the reason why we focused on this today is not to say that people living in other tenures aren't experiencing fuel poverty, but disproportionately people in the private rental sector experience fuel poverty based on the data available. So the chart on the top left there shows that more than any other tenure, people in the private rental sector are more likely to experience fuel poverty. This is especially important in Newham, as we know that Newham residents have the highest proportion of residents living in the private rental sector, but also the size of that sector has grown significantly over the last sort of 8 years or so, which means that potentially with rising rents that we're seeing, residents are going to be more disproportionately impacted than the London average, but also the national average as well. So if we move on to the next slide, please. What that's effectively done is resulted in rising rents across Newham. And I've just seen a comment in the post, which in the chat, which says around private landlords trying to raise their rents to cover their costs. And that's certainly something that we've seen. So I think a lot of the data on the private rental market is relatively anecdotal, and it's just not sort of up to date enough to capture what is a rapidly changing market. But what we're seeing, and through our wider research that we've undertaken, is that we're seeing more and more best and final offers for rental properties going for significantly more than what the asking price is or what the listing price is on Rightmove. Therefore, it's very difficult to understand sort of the true reality of the situation, which is actually a lot worse than a lot of the available data is saying. So these maps here are effectively our trawling of Rightmove, which compares listing prices compared to the ONS data. And the ONS data for a one-bed place, which is the map on the left, estimates that the mean price in Newham is around £1,400 a month. But from a quick trawl of Rightmove, we can tell that immediately is massively underplaying what the reality is within Newham, and it's significantly higher. So if you look at a place like Stratford, in the northwest of the borough, it's sort of approaching sort of over £2,000 for a one-bedroom place. So that's another cost pressure which we've absolutely got to consider as part of our layered analysis of what the cost of living pressures are in Europe. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we can begin. Oh, and one more, please. We can begin. Oh, keep going forward, please. Thank you very much. So we can begin to bring this all together into what this actually means for typical Newham households when we're sort of layering this analysis, and what this actually means in terms of net pay towards the end of the month. So if you move on to the next slide. That's perfect, thank you. What we've done is we've created a tool that models the impact of cost of living crisis based on potential families that could feasibly be, or potential households that could feasibly be living within the borough. And what this effectively shows is based on average households and based on sort of average professional incomes, without significant government support, albeit we await the new government's announcements on this potentially this week, the vast majority of households are going to be significantly impacted by what we're seeing across Newham. And this won't be a surprise to you, but the impact of this is effectively there'll be lots of households that don't typically engage with council services, that are suddenly requiring additional support in order to cover their costs. So the first example we've got here is an example couple, so a civil servant and a marketing professional with a combined income of 67 grand. I think to anyone looking at this, that is deemed a very good household income. I think when we sort of take into account things like travel costs, they've got to get to central London in order to work, and they're renting a one-bed flat in Newham, which costs around £1,400 a month, which is the ONS estimate for a one-bed flat in Newham. But when we go through it, their sort of income left over at the end of the month is around £700. And again, whilst that might seem like a decent amount of money, I think when we're looking at disposable income, that's significantly less than it would have been this time last year. And that obviously has significant knock-on effects for businesses within the borough that rely on discretionary spend in order to sort of sustain local businesses, in order to sustain high street businesses. And that has wider economic impacts as well. So if we move on to the next case study, we've sort of modelled this for a number of households across the borough. And one thing to look at would be key workers across the borough. And the thing that we haven't talked about so far, and something that is vitally important when looking at this, is childcare. And the cost of childcare in London is very expensive, but also people that are delivering childcare need to be able to afford to live in London as well. But when we look at these two key workers, for example, who need to sort of live and work in Newham and rent a two-bed flat and with one child, very quickly we can see without any government intervention, we assume there will be some, it's getting very, very tight to be able to afford to live in Newham by the end of the month. So in terms of discretionary spend, we're down to around £68 a month. Then if the price cap rises further, and inflation rises, we're very, very quickly getting into negative territory and people falling below the poverty line. So we move on to the next one, please. I think it might be the final one. We've just modelled one more example, which is around a sort of a hospitality worker. We know this is very important to Newham's economy. We know a lot of people work in hospitality across the borough, but say that person has to commute into central London. They're living in a flat share, paying around £700 a month, which is the average. Already, with the price cap at £3,500, we expect the government to freeze bills based on the previous price cap, but on the current price cap, that person is already in negative in the red, despite being in full-time work. So that's again showing that work is failing to pay. So if we move on to the next slide. I'll just pass back to Chris to sort of wrap this up.
So yeah, just to wrap up, one additional bit of analysis which isn't presented here but will be in the deck that we send on to you is around the geography as well. And we've looked at this in terms of how these scenarios play out in specific places within the borough, and that too is quite stark, and it becomes very clear that this goes from the issue of poverty being something that's quite geographically focused to being something that starts to affect the whole borough. When we start to look in on places like significant parts of West Ham and East Ham, Plaistow and Manor Park, you start to see locations where the sort of average income left over at the end of the month in summer 2021 was about £350 per month. In some locations that goes down to sort of minus numbers come the winter 2022 forecasts. So significant and stark stuff which we can start to look at specifically by geography, which I think helps our response. Now, in terms of moving on to a response, I think although this is stark and it's quite depressing and incredibly worrying, it is important to recognise that Newham is reasonably well placed in terms of its response. Having a programme like our Newham Money, which provides debt support and income maximisation support for residents, is incredibly important, and that in itself will be a really, really important tool looking forward. I think also recognising that the health response in Newham around COVID-19 was nationally recognised as being best practice, and the fact that community and faith groups within Newham mobilising around mutual aid through the pandemic as well was incredibly impressive, and Newham has a diverse and resourceful population. All of these things are positives that we need to sort of keep in mind as we think about the response. From our point of view, as we thought about how you respond, we sort of think, thinking in short, medium and long term is important. So in the short term, there is a crisis recovery. We are responding to this as if it is what it is really, which is a disaster and a crisis which needs an immediate response. But in the medium term, there are opportunities to refine policy, and reallocate budgets to do things differently. And then in the longer term, we have to recognise that this could be a fundamental change in the way the economy works. Susan and Simon, in the comments as we spoke, talked about work no longer paying, employment no longer being the solution. Absolutely, the way the economy works and the way the economy delivers for people will need to change, in my view. And so we, as a collective, need to be ready for that, and we need to plan for that as well. So thinking longer term and the type of economy, the type of place we want is important as we deal with the short-term effects as well.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just on that latter point, let's not forget that since 2019, the point at which we launched the inclusive economy, inclusive growth strategy and community wealth building, that's precisely what's anchored our approach to the local economy. But notwithstanding that, we can't control those national forces and the policy frame that is shaped by national government. I wanted to pick up on a couple of the questions that are in the chat before we go into the breakout sessions, and indeed invite anyone with any specific comments. You made reference to Susan and Susan Lucas's question alongside Councillor Simon Rush, who both point to the reality that faces many of our residents in light of the insecurity of work, and how when we're presenting the stark consequences of the cost of living crisis in Newham, how can that be weaved into the narrative and the story? So any additional thoughts outside of, well, we need to just pivot our local economy so that it works and it's fair? You're still on mute. Yeah, go on. Over to you, Chris.
So, I mean, I think, you are limited as an under-resourced local authority. You're kind of limited in what you can do through policy. I think I think the direction the council is taking in terms of community wealth building, in terms of a more inclusive economy rather than an inclusive growth approach, is the right way forward. I think thinking about an economy that works from the bottom up rather than the top down is important. So, what you have is a lot of incredibly resilient local economies, which we saw through the pandemic worked for each other. So building upon that rather than trying to encourage new external investments as the sort of driver of the economy, I think is quite important. And embracing things like circular economy principles, as I say, inclusive economy principles, more locally focused economic strategies is really important. But obviously you are limited by the resources available to you. But I think there's a number of, I think in London actually it's quite a good time for this sort of thing, because there's a lot of good progressive councils who are looking to do this sort of thing. So it might be something it will be something you have to do despite the government, I would say. But there is,
I guess it's also ensuring that we make more visible our support infrastructure, the Newham Employment Rights Hub, which provides guidance, support, and actually officer intervention if a resident operating in the insecure gig economy is being exploited. And we know through research that we've previously done that we have some 40,000 residents occupying the grey or black economy that are being exploited, being paid £2 or £3 an hour, and they largely are drawn from our communities of colour, the most, amongst the most vulnerable. And in the context of, rent increases, there was a comment here whether or not the private landlord licensing scheme could be used as an instrument to contain that. Unfortunately, it doesn't extend to rent capping. That requires legislative change at national level, and it's a lobby and ask that we've been pushing alongside the Mayor of London. You'll have noted that the First Minister of Scotland announced that there'll be a rent cap in Scotland, and she announced that yesterday as part of their response. And then there's reference to impact on younger age cohorts. Absolutely, there was research that's been undertaken by the GLA that points to a disproportionate impact on communities of colour in London, and given that 78% of our resident population are from communities of colour, even more pronounced here in Newham, but also young renters and those with disabilities. So there's quite a stark and catastrophic reality facing many households that wouldn't ordinarily think about coming to the council or accessing support from the wider partnership that we've got in place in Newham. I'm conscious of time. I can't see any hands up. People that are dropping comments in the chat, they'll be responded to. But what I'm going to suggest that we do now is that we go into breakout sessions to respond to what you've heard from Chris and Will and what's been presented via the slide deck that's been on the screen. Back everyone, I trust you've had really useful set of discussions in the breakout group. I'm going to be inviting people to feedback from you've been in. Before I do, I'm going to ask Anne if you could kindly share the screen and show slide 14, because we've gone back live and just wanted to sort of sum up where we'd got to prior to breaking out into the group. So this summit is all about our emergency response to the cost of living crisis, because what is clear from the analysis that we've commissioned that here in Newham, the scale of the challenge facing our borough is going to be huge and catastrophic for so many families, including so many more families that have been incubated somewhat over previous years, and this is a period prior to COVID-19, of the impact of austerity. We have this as a character in our borough. We have a section of our community as a consequence of structural issues of inequality, disproportionality, poverty, that have borne the brunt of austerity over the past 12 years or so. We also have a local economy that, in reflecting the decimation of secure jobs, is characterised by insecurity, heightened insecurity, and that's the reason why we have pivoted as a council since 2019 around inclusive economy and community wealth building, and there's a huge amount of work to be done. We've also been mobilising and working in partnership with our voluntary community and faith sectors in order to embed that required infrastructure so that all of us collectively are able to work collaboratively to help across these range of issues, and that very much accelerated during that COVID-19 period, but we're in a very, very different and challenging phase right now. And the insights generated from the research are very stark. It's the combination of those existing challenges that I described in work poverty, low disposable income, the insecurity that brings with it, high housing costs. You know, we're very much at the coalface of the housing crisis here in the capital, and increased prices for all those essentials, food, energy, create a perfect storm here in Newham. And the evidence also points to four main areas of mobilisation that we need to consider or we need to build on based on what we've already got in place: food, energy, housing quality, and housing tenure, that are driving and exacerbating this particular cost of living crisis emergency in Newham. And all of those issues have been discussed in breakout groups. And what I'm going to be asking now is we will come back and I'll invite people to just provide their contributions from what was discussed across the two principal questions that were asked. And if we can go to the next slide, just by way of recapping. So what more can your organisation do now to provide emergency support to residents? And what should we be lobbying government to do more of to help support Newham residents? And once we conclude from the feedback sessions, I'll be jumping onto some additional slides to just set out exactly what it is that we are doing presently. I'm going to be making some announcements about what more we will be doing as a council, and then what happens next following the conclusion of this summit. So if we can just remove the slide, go back to the main forum, and if I can open up to anyone who'd like to share from their breakout session. So I'm going to be looking at hands up, virtual hands up, that is. So does anyone want to come forward first? Right, Darren, I'm actually not going to go with council officers at the moment. Is there anyone who have the community and faith sector? Otherwise, I am going to ask someone myself. Fact, I've seen Julia Bello. Would you be happy to provide some feedback from your breakout session? Annie Fuller, I can see your hand up.
Hi, yes, I'm in the public health team. Our group talked about the need for both short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So like an immediate action plan, and then what we can kind of do in the longer term. In terms of what some of the organisations are doing now, like Subco Trust are cooking meals for people on a daily basis, so 30 to 40 people. So they've set up like a community kitchen, and I know that's something that Andy Gold is looking at putting out more widely. We talked about as well another solution being co-locating organisations together, but needing a practical plan to do this. So enabling organisations to kind of network, know who to talk to, making the spaces known so that people can kind of get together, but then equally needing to overcome the issues like existing contracts that people you know, are supposed to honour. So how do we kind of get through that? Do we want to just focus on question one at the moment? Yeah.
You just do in fact, I'm going to pause you there.
Yeah.
Thanks for now, and then you can come back on the question two. But if I can ask for anyone that contributes, just cover off across both questions. I'm going to be inviting Marla from Skills Enterprise to provide some feedback, and you may not necessarily need to be a facilitator.
Hi, thank you, Sana. In our group, we were discussing about, like, you know, voluntary sector organizations offering more number of services or increased number of hours of services, so that we can have users spending more time in community centers rather than being in-house, so that, you know, they are switching off their heating and lighting. And also we were discussing about that in our center, we were offering increased employment support for our users, because demand for like, you know, additional hours of work is more. So in that way, we were able to support, and also increasing number of, like, you know, benefit advice, so that people don't miss out on the benefits and other grants opportunity that's available for them. And also to tackle digital exclusion, we are supplying free Wi-Fi to people who are struggling to pay for their Wi-Fi and connections as well. And we have increased more timings in terms of training users as well. And we have approached a lot of corporate organizations to donate laptops so that we can give to people who are unable to afford it as well. And so all these we are planning to do in the banner of warmer together, so that we can offer socialization support as well, and offer more of energy advice. So it's very collective thing that we have to do. And also voluntary sector organization apply to funding from other outside the council trust as well, so that we bring in more funding to the borough.
Right, thank you very much, Marla. Some really, really useful and interesting points, particularly around the accessibility of Wi-Fi. And in a short while, I'll be announcing some specific things that will align to some of what you said that we'll be doing as well as a council, but really, really good contributions. I'm going to be inviting Susan Lucas, then Peter Lang to feedback, and Olivia before I go back to others. And apologies if I've missed anyone. Over to you.
I'd just like to comment on the second question. One of the things that I said is that Newham should be really proud of the work that you've done around inclusive economy, an economy premised on resources, not growth. And I think it's really important that you tell that story and partner with others who are doing that work to tell that story on a national level. I suspect that it's going to fall on deaf ears on a national government which is still premised on a neoliberal model, but actually bubbling up from the grassroots, you have got this idea that we need a very different economic narrative, and you need to start now.
Thank you very much, Susan. So I'll make sure that that's very much understood within the organisation in terms of features of what it is that we have been doing since 2018 as part of our language around the current cost of living crisis. And I've actually responded to one of your earlier comments on the chat where you talked about the widening of the household demographic that's going to be sucked into this crisis period right now. And my point being that actually, if you think about the impact of austerity in Newham over the past 12 plus years, we've been in a crisis for a prolonged and pronounced period of time. And so this current cost of living crisis is actually a catastrophic emergency, and it will begin to suck in like a black hole more and more families that may have been cushioned in previous years. And that is going to be a challenge for all of us, because whilst we have come together and have mounted this really impressive and amazing response as a collective, demonstrating the impressive energy of this borough, we're going to be contending with a really different and challenging set of circumstances where we're dealing with families that had never dreamed of coming to a food bank, never dreamed of leaning into the council for help, never thought that they would have to ask where do they go to generate more income through either benefit maximisation and all of those things, and how do we do that in a way that is gentle and sensitive to issues of stigma, and where we need to mobilise our health partners around the emotional impact that that will have on people's sense of self and health and well-being. And I say that because of personal experience, knowing how devastated my mother was when we lost our family home when I was younger. The mental and emotional impact and sense of shame that she carried for so many years was really palpable, and she's still recovering from that. So thank you very much for that, Susan. Right, I'm gonna bring in Peter, then Olivia, then I'm gonna go to Zulfika.
Thanks, Roxana. So we spoke a little bit about things in terms of kind of hard-edged support for people. So, you know, things like income maximization, supporting people around kind of food and, you know, crisis grants and those sorts of practical things that people will need increasingly. But we also spoke about the kind of the soft side of the help and the mental health impact that this is going to have on so many of our communities, and the importance of providing support for people's well-being. And I think there's also a perspective angle here that we need to look at in terms of generous leadership individually and collectively, understanding that the solution's not going to come from the other and them. I think some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, what can I do? Not necessarily what can our organization do, what can our government do, what can our council do? I think we should be saying, what can I do? And I think there is an element of the fact that we need to be better. The circumstances are really, really difficult and challenging, and we can use this as an opportunity to improve and to kind of grow as a community. I think we learned loads of lessons through COVID, and I think that the strategic and the collaborative approach that we learned in COVID must be carried on here through this, and we need to build on that and grow on that. I think ultimately this is an opportunity for us to grow and develop. It's very difficult, but in adversity we can grow.
Yeah, absolutely. As iPhone to everyone has said, we are the East End community is what we do well, and we will bring back. Thank you very much for that, and apologies for naming you iPhone. Your profile doesn't describe your name. So
sorry, it's Alison. Sorry, Roxana, it's Alison.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much.
I should have changed it before. I didn't, and it won't even do it while I'm on Zoom. So apologies there.
Thank you very much. Okay, Olivia.
Hi everyone. So yeah, thank you. I'm speaking from Complex London, and in our breakout room we covered quite a few things. Some of it very much targeted at residents, and some at organisations. So for residents, it was sort of increasing the availability of discretionary funding. We had a Money A&E in our room that was explaining how many people and the influx of people that are needing additional support because of deficit sort of budgets within the household. We also had a few things spoken about around connecting organisations a bit more and providing opportunities for networking, relationship building. You know, I know there's work that's already happening with, social prescribing software where people are going to be signposted better, but building those relationships alongside having something that is so public. Then there was some discussions around, subsidizing or increasing the availability of funding to help households convert or change over to renewable energy sources. And if there's any other programs sort of like that. But then from an organizational perspective, we talked about sort of an initiative around warm spaces, and Compost London looks after the voluntary and community sector, and we know that that's a sort of support for a lot of residents, and they are familiar spaces. So maybe seeing some of those that have buildings that are going to find it increasingly hard to manage financially for community sector organizations, to almost subsidize it and use it as warm spaces. And then also that might touch on the point that Anya brought up earlier around co-locating and the sharing of resources across the sector. We also discussed ideas around communications and how broad that needs to be, and it needs to cover almost outdoor, print, and everything for everyone to know where to go. And from an organizational perspective, we talked about grants now covering things like core costs. Often grants or funding just covers project activity, and we know that there's going to be support for small to medium-sized businesses, but the voluntary sector sometimes feels a bit left out in the cold. And I think there are a need for a view of their core costs or their staffing costs to be included so that they can stay afloat and be able to support the residents that they serve. We looked at things around the high street and the vacant buildings that we do see, and whether there's an opportunity to bring some of those back into use. That I don't, you know, it could be a conversation with landlords or if it's other stakeholders, but it's also, you know, seeing it as a potential base for voluntary sector groups, but also warm spaces, places where residents can go, places that are familiar and local to people, and not leaving spaces that are kind of losing money for landlords, but using it for the benefit of the community that live around and nearby.
Thank you very much, Olivia. And just so that you know, as part of what I'll be announcing shortly, there will be features of what you said included in that, and around energy efficiency, alongside unlocking assets for access to communities. That's also something that's baked into our inclusive economy community wealth building agenda, and there's been quite a significant amount of work that the council's been doing around our own assets that aren't being optimised because of a whole set of reasons, and we've just finalised the unlocking our assets strategy, which you'll be seeing more of. I'm conscious of time. Councillor Zulfikar Ali, if you could kindly post your comments, if that's okay. I've just been to get the voices of colleagues from our voluntary sector. There's Peter who wanted to say something, but your hand symbol isn't working. So that's Peter Ekakora.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, you said it quite correctly. Thank you very much for giving me the time. I obviously work for Positivist, and we work with Newham residents who are living with or affected by HIV. What I said in our group was that as much as money works is very good, I think in practical terms, it doesn't really meet the needs of the residents. Why? Because we cannot send everybody there and get the service on the same day. Give you a good example. If somebody comes in, they say, they got an advised service anywhere in the borough and say, my meter's gone off, I don't have any money. So the first thing you think about is going to Money Works. No, actually, we need to have small grants that we can give people. And I think you need to think about how you can decentralize some kind of grant system to the other organizations, to the small community organizations. And as it's been said before again, I think it's really better to co-locate advice with practical support together, because then somebody gets a holistic service. They come in for advice, they get food. If they don't have gas, they also get the gas at the same time. So I think we need to think about that model in different community organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Right, finally, I'm going to be bringing in Joe Lyons. Over to you.
Thanks, Roxana. So it's been firstly fascinating in terms of everyone's contributions and views. And I think one thing that strikes me over the kind of the past maybe 9 years in terms of looking at from a voluntary sector perspective, children and young people service, COVID response, and now this crisis, is the collaboration that's needed between all of the voluntary sector to then work with all of the public sector to then bring in the private sector. And I think those three sectors are going to be what's in you and what's going to be able to get us through this crisis working together. And I think taking my West Ham hat off, being a part of One Newham, and I think it's up to about 135 member organisations that are part of that collaborative now, and as a voice of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of residents that fit into those community organisations and community groups. I think, I can't speak for One Newham at the moment because I wouldn't have the authority, but I think as a collective, we'll be absolutely keen to explore how we can collaborate again with the private and public sector to help this situation.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I'd be really keen to explore sort of that deepening of collaboration with the alliance of voluntary sectors organisations that you're involved in as part of boosting sort of our response. I'm gonna, being conscious of time, just ask if slide 16 can just be shared on screen, and we're going to conclude with what it is that we're currently doing, what we're going to be putting in place, and then what happens next following the conclusion of today's summit. So just wanted to give everyone an overview of what it is that we're already doing and what we're intending to build on. So here you'll see an overview of key things that we've been mobilising around over the past 4 years, and particularly accelerated in response to the COVID-19 situation we found ourselves in. On the Eat for Free scheme, so this in essence saves households with primary school age kids £500 per child per year through an investment of £6 million from the council, directly from the council. As you can see here, through the Newham Food Alliance, there's some 50 tonnes of food that's been distributed weekly to households in this borough, and that comprises of 30 tonnes of surplus food and some 20 tonnes of food that's sourced from other avenues being distributed. And also the work that we're doing through our Newham service, through our Newham Money, our Newham Works, our work around Employment Rights Hub, around income maximisation, and the whole package around that. And then, mobilising big anchor partners and companies located in Newham to become London Living Wage employees, because that's what we are, and it's a core feature of our community of building agenda and wider inclusive economy strategy that we talked about earlier. If we can move on to the next slide. In terms of what we will be announcing, and the issue will be going out in a short while, probably early afternoon. Today I'm going to be announcing that the council will work with a whole range of partners to deliver a network of warm havens across the borough, where libraries, leisure centres, community buildings, NHS buildings, specific places are made available to those in need, alongside community hot mills in partnership with the Newham Food Alliance. And the exact locations and timings will be announced in due course. And then we'll also be, as part of enabling people to navigate where those spaces are, be producing the resources to make it easy for people to identify and find out. We're also going to be continuing our work with the voluntary, community and faith sector around how we can enhance our collective, not just understanding, but our information about what we can be providing to our cohort of residents that we're dealing with, and really amplify our package of offer, or menu of offer, as it were, forgive the pun, to our wider community cohort, because there's something that's going to be very, very important around destigmatising. I was really interested in one of the earlier comments when we were doing the feedback relating to the Wi-Fi access, but as we all know, as has emerged through the breakout sessions, there's a lot more that we can do collectively. So going on to the next slide, what we will be doing, following on from today's conversation, I'll be pulling that together with officer colleagues. We'll be producing an action plan, building on and drawing on what's been discussed today in the breakout sessions. It will be shared with a cost of living task force, which I'll be convening over the next couple of weeks, comprising of representatives from the range of organisations that we have here. I'll also be organising a town hall style event open to all residents in Newham, so that we can be talking directly to the community about what it is that we're putting in place, what is available, and where they can go for help. And then we'll also be similarly doing a business focused event, because as has been expressed in the chat, the inflationary pressures facing organisations, be those businesses in the private sector, in the public sector, in the voluntary sector, we're also all going to be challenged in terms of energy costs and how we maintain those. Stuff around energy conservation in homes, and that wider piece around how we can, in the medium and long term, incubate our borough from what inevitably will be ongoing, enduring shocks to the global economy as a consequence of conflict anywhere in the world is something that we're going to have to also focus on, and we'll come back with thinking around that in due course. And we will, of course, continue our lobbying and our asks of government for a fairer deal for Newham. And we will be working in collaboration with other local authorities in London through London councils, and directly working in collaboration with the Mayor of London. And as pointed out here, we are in support of his lobbying of national government for a freeze in rent, which will go some way in helping and providing some reassurance to our residents. So I wanted to thank everyone for making the time to be here, for staying on for a few minutes longer. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the not too distant future as we come back together, check against progress, discuss the action plan that's been pulled together. And I'm not intending for that to be in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time. I'm looking at quite a rapid turnaround. So keep an eye out on an email coming in over the next couple of days with regards to, at the very least, a save the date. And I'll conclude by lastly, but certainly not finally, thank you so much for your individual and organisational efforts and the collaboration and commitment that you have demonstrated and shown to our borough and the people in this borough. I genuinely am deeply grateful, and I can't think of a more awesome bunch of people to be working with during these absolutely crushing and catastrophic times. And I just salute every single one of you for your ongoing and enduring efforts, and for that I will be eternally grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Peter. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Bye.